All right, welcome to part 10 of our biological basis of behavior unit. This is also the final section that we're going to talk about here. And what we're going to do to wrap this up is talk about genetics and evolution. Now, this is obviously a really deep and really expansive topic, and there's tons of stuff to talk about. What we're really going to try and do is lay kind of a groundwork of terminology and just basics that you need to know, and then once we have that, you should be able to kind of apply it to different situations, and that's really the only way I think you should see it on the AP Psych test. And a lot of this too should hopefully be at least like semi-review. If you've taken any sort of like biology class, for example, you should have heard a lot of this terminology before. So the first thing we're going to talk about is genes, and why we're kind of talking about this is really important. So when we talk about genetics and evolution, really one of the biggest questions as far as psychology goes is trying to determine where different characteristics come from. Why do people act certain ways? What makes someone, smart or maybe less intelligent? What causes people to, maybe have different traits? What makes someone tall or fast or whatever? And there's basically two places that different traits can come from. They can be hereditary, which would be the nature side of things, that's our genetics, or they can be the environment that we're in, right? We call that nurture. So heredity is the genetic transfer of characteristics from parents to their offspring, all right? And we're going to talk about how that happens, obviously, through like DNA and genes, but there's a certain amount of information that comes from each of your parents that is passed down to you that then is going to obviously affect who you are in a whole bunch of different ways. Now, our environment is going to be everything that is non-genetic. Now, this is really important because it starts really early. So even when we're talking about like prenatal nutrition, which is a baby growing in their mother's stomach, what your mom eats is considered environment. It's considered nurture. And depending on what's happening there, that can obviously have effects on you later on in life. So again, our heredity is only the genes that are passed down from our parents. The environment is everything else. Okay, everything else is going to be that side. And we'll watch a little video, it kind of disappeared here, that's going to talk about a little bit of an example of actually how the environment can affect our biology. And I think this is important because we oftentimes have this idea that like the nature side is anything biological. It's only your genes. So if the environment changes your biology, that's the environment having effect, not your heredity, not the nature side of things. So the first kind of things to break down are chromosomes and then DNA. The next part we're going to talk about genes and the genome. And again, we're just kind of breaking these down into pieces. So what a chromosome is a thread-like structure that is made out of DNA. And what our DNA is going to be containing is all of these genes. So we're kind of like stacking inside out. So we've got genes that make up strands of DNA. These strands of DNA then make up chromosomes. So here's our chromosome right here. We get 23 chromosomes from each parent. So 46 total. And all of these chromosomes are going to be in all of our cells. So all of our cells contain all of our genes, all of our DNA. So what is DNA? So the full name of DNA is deoxyribonucleic acid. Now, you're probably never going to use that term or need it, but that's what they're referring to. So what DNA is a really complex molecule that is just holding all of this information. All right? You can kind of think of it like a really long what's the word that I wanted to use? Like not a pamphlet, but like a scroll kind of, right? It's this really extensively long, rolled out piece of just information. And that information is all of the different things that make up our body. So every part of our body, everything it does, all of the functions, all the parts have to be held in that DNA. So let's talk about genes and the genome a little bit. Now, I mentioned before that our DNA is basically made up of genes, or we can at least break it up into it. So what genes are chunks of our DNA, segments of it. And what those segments do is create proteins. So again, we're not going to delve like super deep into like what we're made out of, but basically the idea is that we have these genes, these chunks of our DNA that can then create proteins that then have jobs and do different things or create different parts of our body or have different functions. Okay. Now, one thing that's really important to talk about with genes is that we can have genes that are active or what's called expressed or inactive. So we have genes in our body that might not necessarily be doing anything. Really good example of this could be like your hair color, right? Specifically, like if you have family members that have red hair. Red hair is a recessive trait, so it's not very common for it to be expressed. But you can have a kid, and if your partner also has that gene for red hair, they can have red hair, even if both of you are brunettes. Okay, so we have genes in our bodies that just aren't being expressed. They're not active. They're not doing anything, but they can still be there. Now, if we want to talk about everything as a whole, that would be our genome. So our genome is all of our genes, all of our DNA. And again, and this is why if you've probably heard of like the Human Genome Project, which the whole project was about going through and finding all of these genes. What are they? What are all the different parts of all of our DNA? And that was the idea, is going through and it's called not synchronizing it, but going through and basically finding all these different genes. So that would be the genome. Now, one thing to know about genes and the genome in general is that very, very small changes can have very big effects on who you are or what the organism is. So a really nice example of that is that humans and chimpanzees share 96% of their genes. So genetically, we are very similar to them. But obviously, there's huge differences between humans and chimpanzees, right? There's definitely similarities as well, but there's a lot of differences, physical, psychological, mentally. There's a lot that's going on that's separating us. And those differences are happening in 4% of our genes. Okay, so it's kind of important to see that those changes, really small ones, can have really big effects. So this is going to lead us to twin studies and actually adoption studies as well. Now, we'll kind of talk about this a little bit more in depth in some of our other units, like learning, we talk about it a little bit more. Developmental, we talk about it a little bit more. Testing and individual differences, we'll talk about it a little bit more. But just kind of to talk about why they're important. So basically the idea is that one of the things we want to do as psychologists is figure out where do different things come from, right? We were trying to solve this problem of nature and nurture. And it's really important because if we find out that a certain trait, let's say something like, let's say like intelligence, for example, because that's a trait we really care about. If we find out that intelligence is entirely based on your heredity, right, on your parents, if your parents are intelligent, then that's going to make you intelligent, or there's certain genes that are going to cause you to be intelligent, well, that means that we can start looking at that genetically. We could look at people's genetics and tell how intelligent they are, right? And there's not really anything we can do about it. On the other hand, if we find out that intelligence is really impacted by your environment, well, now we can start doing things to our environment that will hopefully make everybody more intelligent. So it's really important for us to figure out, where do these things happen? What's causing people to be this way or that way? Is it because of their genes? Is it because of their environment? Is it a combination of both? And twin studies and adoption studies are one of the biggest ways that we do that. So there's two different types of twins, and there's actually technically more than this, but there's two main ones that we really care about. The first one is identical or monozygotic twins. So what monozygotic twins are is where there is one egg from the mother that is fertilized by a single sperm cell. And then what happens is that egg actually splits into two. So usually speaking, what happens is you'd have one egg that's fertilized by one sperm cell, and then it just stays together and it develops and develops and develops. We'll talk about this when we get to development, and it becomes one baby. In monozygotic twins, what's happening in identical twins, right? What's happening is that cell is splitting into two, and then you have two genetically identical people. Okay, two genetically identical people. Now, why this is really important is they are one of the best ways for us to study this question of nature versus nurture, because they are genetically the exact same. So if we put them in the same situations, we would expect them to have the same outcomes. And what we can start doing is looking at, okay, well, if I put these two twins, these identical twins, into different situations, different environments, I can start looking at, okay, how are they different? How are they similar? Right? Because if they're in two totally different environments, the things that make them similar are probably caused by, their genes. They're more heritable. The things that they're really different on are going to be caused by their environment. And again, we can start kind of figuring that out. We can also look at things like fraternal twins. There's also like sibling studies, which are basically the same thing as fraternal or dizygotic twins. Now, these will also be used, but they're not used as much. So I believe siblings have about 25% of their genes in common. So they are still, more closely related than like two random people, but 25% obviously isn't a ton. So fraternal or dizygotic twins are basically the same as brothers and sisters when you want to think like genetically. So the way that happens is basically you actually have two egg cells that are in the womb at the same time that get fertilized by two different sperm cells. So basically it's just like a brother and a sister, a normal brother and a sister, or brothers, but it's happening at the same time. They're just being born at the same time. Genetically, there's not that much difference. We're going to watch this little example during class. It's like a short little news article story actually, but it's about these two identical twins that found each other later on in life. And one of the things we can kind of look at is ways that they're similar, ways that they're different, and kind of think, okay, what can we do with this idea, and how can we learn about our biology, our heritability, our genes from that. We're also I'll talk a little bit more. There's a very, very good film. We probably won't watch it in class, but I'll see if I can find a way to get you. That's really all about twin studies, but it focuses on three triplets. They were identical triplets that were all separated at birth. So we'll kind of talk about that a little bit as well. So let's talk about heritability a little bit more. So what is it? So basically what heritability is the proportion of variation among individuals in a group that we can attribute to genes. Okay? That we can attribute to genes. So again, the idea is how much of certain traits come from genes. So some of the examples we have are things like personality traits. We say personality traits is about 40% of it comes from your genetics, right? Which makes sense. If any of you have siblings, you're probably like pretty different than your sibling, or you can even have identical twins that in like personality wise are actually pretty different. So it's only about 40% there. Intelligence is about 66%. So again, a bigger chunk, but not all of it. Height is one of our most heritable genes. It's at about 90%. So, and this is again something that should probably be like pretty understandable, right? Like there's not very often do you see someone with really short parents where both of them are really short and then they're really tall, right? Or vice versa. You very rarely see someone who's got, a mom and a dad that are over 6 feet tall and then they're like 5'2", right? That would be really, really surprising. A huge portion of our height comes from heritability. Now, again, though, notice that it's still 90%. There's very few traits, at least ones that we really care about, that are 100% or 0% heritable, right? So even though height has other factors, or even though height is very heritable, there are a lot of other factors. And actually, this little graph underneath is showing that. So what it's showing here is the difference in height between North and South Korea. All right. Now, as you look at that, what you probably notice is the black line, which is South Korea, right? The younger people are much taller, right, than the older people there. And in North Korea, it basically stays the same. But what's interesting is at this older age group, they basically meet. So one of the big questions you might ask is, well, what's going on here? Why is there this big difference in North and South Korea, right? They're right next to each other. They used to be the same country. Why we wouldn't really expect to see a huge difference in their genetics, right? And so one of the things that's important though is at right about this time, right, this is when North and South Korea split. And so that separation then is what we think causes this change, right? And one big part of it, or one big way of explaining it, has to do with food, right? Are the people in South Korea basically getting more and better food? A lot of times also too, foods nowadays have hormones in them, which is why it's really common for kids now to be a lot bigger than their parents. And so that split then causes maybe these genes are just being expressed more, where here that 10% that's affecting height is still having an effect. Okay. Now notice too, like this is like 6 inches different. So which is a pretty big chunk, right? But it's not like, they're 3 feet taller than them or anything like that. But it is having an effect. So next thing we're going to talk about is epigenetics. And epigenetics is very, very complicated. It's a relatively new field of study. And really what it's about is how does the environment influence our genes? Now, what's important is they don't necessarily change your genes. There have been studies about that, and I'm just not knowledgeable enough to really give you deep information about how our genes actually change. But epigenetics is all about how our how the environment changes our gene expression. So, like I mentioned before, some genes are active and some are inactive. And epigenetics is again looking at how does our environment change or determine how these different genes are doing what they're doing. How does it cause some to become active or some to become inactive, or how does it change how they're expressed? Right? A nice way to think of it is how do they trigger or block genetic expression? And so it says here genes are self-regulating, meaning that they react to our environment. So one thing that's interesting is there's actually, as we go through life, even though our genes might stay the same, what they're doing changes. There was a really interesting video, and I haven't been able to find it. It was like a documentary I watched. I haven't been able to find it since then, but one of the things they talked about was they looked at identical twins, and they were specifically studying identical twins where as adults, they were usually in their 30s or 40s or older. One of them had clinical depression and one didn't. And what they were looking at was they were trying to figure out, well, why is that? Why is one of them, going through depression and one of them's not? And one of the things they found was they actually found differences in their genetic code. Now, again, I'm not enough of an aficionado of chemistry and biology and cellular molecularology and all that kind of stuff to give you a really good example, but basically they found differences in their code, right, and what was going on. So some of the questions become then, okay, how can our environment start affecting us in this way where we're literally seeing differences? We'll watch this video again in class, this nature versus nurture, this epigenetics talk, but they'll kind of give a little bit deeper example of what's going on here. And this is also what this GIF is showing, is one of the ways that our gene expression can be changed is by different things basically tightening or loosening our DNA. And so the little guys that walk across and actually read it have either a harder time reading it if it's tightened and you can kind of see it gets a little hard to read, or an easier time to reading it if it's looser, and then it's going to be expressed more. All right, so we'll kind of delve into that. But again, realistically for AP Psych, what they really want you just to know is that what epigenetics is, and just understand that our gene expression can be affected by the environment. So that's going to get us to evolution a little bit and evolutionary psychology. Now we will kind of come back to this evolution over and over again as we talk about different things throughout different units and where we think things kind of connect. But there's a few kind of base terms and ideas that we have to understand as we go forward. So one of the big ones is natural selection. Now, you've probably all heard of natural selection before, but it's really important to kind of go over a really clear definition, because it's also one of those terms that we tend to have inaccurate ideas about. We tend to kind of think sometimes that it's one thing and realistically it's not. Same thing with mutations, really. So what is natural selection? So basically the idea of natural selection is that traits that are enable a organism to survive or reproduce in wherever they live in their environment will be the most likely to be passed on to the next generation, right? A simple way that this is often put is survival of the fittest. Now, what's really important is there's two pieces. Part of it is survival, the other part of it is reproduction. There are some traits that definitely do not help organisms survive, but make them much more likely to reproduce. And again, like, you can live for 100 years, but if you don't ever reproduce, then your genes aren't going anywhere. They're not getting passed on. So it's usually a little bit of a combination, right? Now, obviously, for a lot of organisms, the longer you survive, the more likely you are to be able to reproduce or reproduce more. So it's kind of like a combination or a mix and match of the two. Okay? So again, what's happening here, the idea is this, and I think maybe this GIF in the bottom corner is a really nice example, right? Is if you have a bunch of beetles and they live on green leaves, and some of those beetles are green and some are red and some are orange, the orange and the red ones are going to be more likely to be eaten by other animals because it's easier to see them. So because they're being eaten, right, they're going to be less likely to pass on their genes. And because they're less likely to pass on their genes, the next generation of beetles is going to be more likely to be green. And that'll continue on and on and on and on and on for thousands of years, right? And slowly that population of the other colored beetles will slowly fade away, or they'll change until, they're all green, or they all have some other way of kind of adapting. Now, again, though, that's a really good example of the survival side. The reproduction side isn't necessarily always like that. I think a good example is something like mayflies. If I'm not thinking about a different bug, they live for literally 12 hours. They are born or they hatch, I guess, and they fly around for 12 hours. They mate, which I believe they do in ponds. They don't actually mate. They fertilize eggs or whatever, and then they die, and that's it. Right now, obviously, whenever mayflies mutated this gene that basically caused their lifespan to only be 12 hours, that wasn't a good thing for survival, right? But it may have helped with reproduction, or it may have helped with something else. So it's important to think of, survival, but it's not always necessarily going to be survival. It's survival, but also reproduction. It's both of those factors. Another thing that's really important we talk about is mutations. So the way natural selection, what it's doing is it's basically just taking out things that aren't working, aren't allowing reproduction, or aren't allowing survival, or both. Now, as we have kids, if we look at thousands of years, and animals or whatever it is reproducing, we're going to see mutations. So what a mutation is a random error in the genetic code of that organism. So basically, you have a kid, and there's mutation would be small little errors in the code. So it's not the exact genes that came from you. There was something that is a little different. It's changed. Now, what's really important about this is that it is completely random. So a lot of times we like to think of evolution as going towards something, right? We like to think that animals are evolving towards an end goal, but they're not. We're evolving randomly. Now, because of natural selection, we're going to get rid of the things that don't work in that environment, but it doesn't necessarily mean we're moving somewhere, right? So the idea that we're evolving towards intelligence isn't necessarily true, right? We could be on Earth for a million or a billion more years and may not ever see another intelligent life form, right? It really depends on this random kind of roll of the dice of what we're going to see. Okay, so some mutations are going to be really useful, some of them are not, right? Now, ideally, realistically in natural selection, what should happen is those really useful traits should make us more likely to live, more likely to reproduce, so then those will become more and more common. Those traits that are not useful will become less likely to reproduce or less likely to survive, and then, they'll slowly kind of fade out. All right, but it's very much like a random process that takes thousands, if not millions of years, depending on, what the changes kind of are. So the last thing we're gonna do here is we're gonna play this video and we're gonna talk about these questions a little bit in class. So one of the big things that we use evolution for in psychology is trying to explain similarities across people, basically, right? Across the world for humans specifically, right? Because obviously psychology, we're mostly focused on humans, at least for our class, right? So why are there things that, regardless of where you live in the world, you experience as a human being, right? And there's kind of some questions here. So like one example is, why do women often experience morning sickness early on in a pregnancy, right? And we know that's not a cultural thing because it happens to women regardless of your cultural background or regardless of your genetics. So why is that? Why is that we have this commonality? Why do human beings in general love the taste of sweets and fats, right? Why do we like that taste? Why, and again, that's across cultures. Now, we're going to see differences, right? Like in the US, we're probably going to see a little more emphasis on the sweets and the fats, but regardless of that, that's still a flavor that we like. Why is that? Across cultures, across the world, why are men more sexually motivated than women? Right? Now, again, all of these pieces aren't looking at individual people, right? Because there's obviously going to be differences in men and women as individuals, but as a group, as a whole, if we took all the men and all the women, right, why do we see that men are more sexually motivated than women? So one of the things we're going to do in class, we're actually going to talk about these questions a little bit more, and I think we'll so kind of be thinking about them, I guess, in the back of your head. But how would you explain this? How would evolution explain or answer these different questions? Okay, we're also going to watch this really nice video. Bo Lotto is a psychologist. We're going to see him in our next unit, actually, sensation perception. And he's going to talk a little bit about how evolution really is impacting our perception, right? How is what we see being caused by evolution, basically. So we'll kind of dig into this a little bit more in class. All right, so this is the final section of all of our biology unit. Please make sure you take some time and go through and do a nice quick summary of the genetics and evolution section, and then come to class ready to kind of have a discussion here.